Okay, today we're looking at Lecture 8 in the winter 1931 term of Jung's Vision Seminars. Last time we saw the vivid imagery of the black snake, and recall that Christiana has moved from her vegetative growth phase, which is the sort of naturalistic transcendental function between earth and heaven. She followed the previously identified half animal, half human god into the unconscious of the cavern, and there she encountered 3 snakes, 2 white snakes and a black snake. Recall that we interpreted the black snake as the subjective attitude. It's the poisonous perspective of the human individual, which has been neglected and repressed into the shadow, and contains within it the possibility of both poison and growth, given its green eyes. And we can see that, and we'll get to this towards the end of this lecture, the notion of abasement here is crucial. Abaissement is French for lowering. It has to do with the lowering of consciousness so that the individual can see the autonomous movements of the symbols of the unconscious, and we'll get to that soon. So given that the visioner is confronting the black snake of the subjective attitude, we might ask, what is the proper orientation of the human individual to the black snake? On the one hand, recall last time there was the possible interpretation of eating the black snake as becoming possessed by the devil or by evil. Of course, the black snake, representing the personification of the shadow, could contain within it the elements of demonic desire. And so the idea here is that maybe eating the snake is a form of possession. This would follow one train of reasoning that Jung, for better or worse, correct or not, ascribes to Nietzsche as the situation in which we saw the visioner resisting these snakes, whereupon they constricted her movement, leading her to the possibility that maybe the only response to this is the incorporation of the snake, the eating of the snake that constrains her movement. One way of thinking about the possibility that incorporating the black snake is a possession of evil would be the notion that upon consuming this apparently evil force, one derives a certain level of inflation, wherein their activities are then motivated by the personified attributes of the black snake. So if the snake is evil and represents sort of pagan or unholy natural desires, then eating a snake would cause an inflation, and the person would become demonically possessed. Jung attributes this interpretation to Nietzsche, and Jung says, we saw last time, that Nietzsche avoided the incorporation of the black snake of subjectivity until his imminent collapse, or his collapse to psychosis, by clinging to the experience of ecstasis, which is the experience of the holy other God, which for Nietzsche was the concept of the overman, to which he would like to have willed himself to its will. So the notion is that through the forced willing of the ascent to the ecstatic God, the subjective black snake is avoided, and thereby the inflation by the demonic is avoided. Jung, of course, mentions and sees that this desire for ascent to the ecstatic God led to Nietzsche's eventual collapse, the eventual collapse being the collapse into the black snake, which is utter subjectivity, or abaissement, which would be the total lowering of rational consciousness and its consumption by the shadow subjectivity. The other approach here would be to take the human element in the snake seriously. The notion that the black snake represents not just demonic desire, but also some level of covering or persona, or the conscious attitude towards the rejected shadow self, which contains within it the possibility of transformation. So this is not a conventional interpretation of the snake, which seems to be demonized in mainstream Christianity. The notion here, then, in comparison to resistance, incorporation, and inflation, would be resistance, incorporation, and deflation. The notion being that the snake is not a possessive quality, although it is to some extent, but what it really is doing to some degree is it's poisoning the human individual with their own unconscious subjectivity. And that poisoning of the individual constrains their movement in such a way that they become deflated. They become more in tune with the earth and with their unconscious longings. And so instead of a possession by evil, they are actually poisoned and taken down a peg, reduced in their ability to function. And this would be, in some ways, I think, a Christian interpretation to the extent that Christ embraced his subjectivity and was poisoned by the projections of the Pharisees, right? This is kind of the microcosm that Christians provide. He was poisoned by he received the slings and arrows of the Pharisees, and in the incorporation of the rejected side of the Pharisaical community, right? Christ embodied the rejective subjectivity of the community he found himself in. He took the poison of the discarded elements of society, which just so happened to turn out, in Christ's case, this is the popular interpretation, to be the very qualities that connect man with God. And so the snake, to this degree, could represent a certain self-poisoning, which is being poisoned by the prevailing milieu in such a way that you are at once restricted in your movements, you become the pariah, but you also connect with something true. And so these are the two possible interpretations of the black snake. The black snake here representing Jung's concept of the shadow, and the discussion we've now had about resistance and incorporation being the means of integrating the shadow. So the shadow is personified by this black snake, which is consumed, and that is the integration of the shadow into the personality. And so this could go two ways, if we discussed. The notion here is there is a certain apperception or integration of the shadow qualities into the person. So that's what Christiana did in her descent into the unconscious, into the cavern, after following the horny goat. Okay, so the vision continues. She emerged from the cave with a white snake and the goat. So now she's coming out of the cave. The white snake is around her head. The black snake, of course, is in her belly. Jung makes comments about the possibility that this might implicate other orifices, and there's all kinds of other imagery about penetration, digestion. There's really a number. It doesn't really matter into which orifice the snake goes, as long as it goes in. So the cave, we might comment here, represents the unconscious. And one note that I might mention as an aside, the notion of depression in its sort of prevailing attitude in the clinical mainstream is that it is a deficit in functioning. I would suggest, according to these visions, and also certain Eastern traditions which have to do with a literal going into a cave. This is the work, I can't find the author, I might be able to reference it, in which the individual goes into the dark cave until the lights come on. That meaning that the inner light, they're looking for the inner light. So if you go into a dark cave and you kind of darken all of your senses, what comes out is the inner light. And this is the notion that I think needs to be incorporated into mainstream understandings of depression, which is a depression is the darkening of the outer world so that the light of the images of the unconscious might be projected onto the world. So by darkening the senses, the internal senses become heightened, and the individual begins to receive certain symbolic pictures of what it is that their unconscious is compelling them to do. And so I think this would be a very beneficial way of looking at depression. It's a physiological response to a failures in adaptation to the outer world, and the unconscious is trying to help the person heal by providing them with the images of the psychological dynamics that are happening within them. And so if you allow the depressed patient to become depressed, what you'll find in an exploration of the patient's unconscious would be the very images that the unconscious is providing as a means of adaptation. So depression is a sort of withdrawing in order to understand the lay of the land, as it were, of the psyche, so it might be better adapted to the outer world. So the notion here then is that in the unconscious, in the cave, what Christiana was able to do is she was able to see the images of the unconscious, to suspend them in such a way that we'll see leads to their eventual dissipation. And so this viewing and apperception of the shadow is the actual means of their resolution. Often we see that in mainstream psychology, the notion is that one must battle their inner demons, or one must devise strategies for avoiding the incorporation of the shadow. And this, to me, is misguided. So to resist these images is to give them power And this, of course, is encoded in biblical language. And there's all kinds of historical reasons for the specific imagery. But the notion is that if one asks for your coat, I forgot what is the exact, if one slaps you on the face, you turn your other cheek. Oh, if someone asks you to walk a mile, you walk two. The idea is resisting the images of the unconscious empowers them, and it leads to the stalemate of functioning. But the proper orientation towards the unconscious symbolism is not one necessarily of identification for the purposes, right? I mean, you don't want to identify with your dreams or your visions, but if you understand them, then you understand your psychological state, and that's helpful for adaptation. So her emergence from the cave is a sort of rebirth imagery in which she becomes dependent on the poison cure. So the cure to her psychological state is a certain level of poisoning by the inner symbolism vis-a-vis the outer world. Okay, the vision continues. The black snake, which I had swallowed, now leapt from my throat and fell upon a golden disc. Instantly it was transformed into a handful of ashes. So I think the really interesting parallel here, and this is where I think Jung is inescapably Protestant to the extent that he's involved in this, is the notion in theodicy that we don't know good and evil. Good and evil is determined by God in the fullness of time. And so what had previously appeared as a ominous snake is now the seedbed of transformation. And so the imagery here is she ingested the snake underground. She apperceived or integrated the shadow in such a way that it became conscious. And now, coming back into the light, into the world, into the external realities, the dark snake is brought with her to the surface. This is, in religious imagery, the notion that the snake was captured and lifted up in the wilderness, as it were. So now conscious, the snake seeks its transformation in the fire. And so the idea is Christiana descended into the unconscious, encountered the shadow, brought the shadow up, and now the shadow is doing some work. It's not possessive in the sense of she is now an evil person, but she is now deeply subjectivized. And the notion is, and this is the fundamental Christian notion, is that the deepest layers of my subjectivity are needed in the world. They are transformative of myself and of those around me. This is the deepest sense of the Christian mystery. And it's encoded here beautifully in the visions. Okay. All right. So the vision then says, I walked on alone until I came to a black wall. Upon the wall, I saw a star and an eye. I walked along it, seeing for some way to penetrate it and to pass beyond. Okay, so the snake comes out. She's offering something to the world. She's offering. She's acknowledged that she has a shadow quality. She's offering the shadow quality to the world as a sacrifice because both she and the world need it in some deep fundamental way. Right? Christ was rejected. He was rejected as the very thing that the world needed. So she's offering her shadow to the world in this sacrificial way. The snake is disintegrated, and in the sun disk, and now a consequence of her willingness to bring the shadow into the world is that she is given the revelation of a divine eye. And so this is critical. This mirrors in many ways in the first series of lectures in the fall, the experience with the god Pan, where the ecstatic reality of suffering and joy are revealed to her in the eyes of the animal. This is a continuation and a deepening and really a more pure form of that ecstatic experience where she sees the revelation of the eye. So the eye is sort of the limit. So we talked about how the animal god, the dual animal god, is the bottom of the collective unconscious. This is now sort of the infrastructure of the collective unconscious. It's hypostasis as such. It's subjectivity as such. She's not seeing it personified in woe and ecstasy or joy. She's seeing it as pure subjectivity, which is the sort of if the animal is the ground, this is the below the ground. If you can get below the ground, this is the notion at least. So not darkness of personified subjectivity. It's not personal shadow. It's subjectivity itself. And the conundrum that faces one who has encountered this eye is that it both sees and it is seen. And this is part of the duality, but it's somehow contained within one. And that's the parallel with the prior revelation of God. It's irreducible. It's a subjectivity that is seen and sees. And we know that it sees because we feel seen. And we see it because we feel seen. And so it's in that being seen that the irreducible juxtaposition of introversion and extroversion, of subjective and objective, is reified in this unitary being. And so this becomes critical for the third movement. So we've talked about two movements. There's ecstasis, which is the experience of this dual God. There's metohi, which is the living out of the truth of duality. And then there is a third concept, which I'm going to get to, which has to do with why it is that anybody would encounter a dual God, why anybody would try to live out the truth of the dual God, and we'll get to that soon. So where in the prior vision of the animal, there was a moral point of view, good and evil in the same being, this is now an amoral duality. The I is given as an answer to the highest social question. And this is what now I want to talk about. This is the third movement. In relationships with others, the question posed by this dual image I of introversion and extroversion, objectivity and subjectivity, the question that this poses, the irreducible, unavoidable question, is in social relationships, is what I'm doing a projection of myself and an introjection of me by the other? Am I imposing my psychological framework on somebody else? Or is it the projection of the other and my interjection of it? Am I allowing the other to dictate the framework in which I experience reality? This is the fundamental confusion in social relationship. It's the alchemical confusion of the I, which is the highest principle, and the limit of human experience. So this is the fundamental quandary, which has been developed into an entire profession in psychotherapeutic work. It's the sort of driving factor, the confounding factor in all social conflict. Who's telling who what to do? Okay, so let me tie this then to the Christian metaphysics of God's duality, or God's Trinity, really. I think there's two ways to think about this. There's the Son of God and there's the Holy Spirit. So let's just talk Christian for a minute. The Son of God is the God in others, seen through flesh, united in one person. So the Holy Spirit is the experience of the pure movement of God, as it were. The experience of the pure hypostasis of reality. It's not the hypostasis. The Father is the unapproachable, but it is the experience of the pure hypostasis. And in each individual, there exists both the ego as a sort of subjective factor. We might think of the self as the totality of the psyche, which is the true mirror image of the hypostasis of God. But in each individual, there's the ecstatic. There's me and there's God. And we have a relationship through participation, metohi. That's the introverted approach. The extroverted version is the Son of God. The Son of God is the experience of perfected subjectivity in another. It's humility, sacrifice, love, and patience. So you have these two things happening within Christian metaphysics, and I think they both lead to, so you have ecstasy and metohi, and I think they lead to the third thing, which is syndiarumeni. Syndiarumeni is a concept of Maximus the Confessor, which Zuzulus brings into his work. Zuzulus brings it to his work on being as communion. He translates it as the co-divided self. So within the human individual, there exist two selves, conscious and unconscious, God and man. And the idea is that in a relationship, this is a Jungian idea, in the relationship between two individuals, there are two interactions. So there's actually four things happening. Conscious and unconscious of each are interacting with each other. So that's four possible combinations. The idea, the totality of the idea in this lecture, is that if one brings up the dark qualities of oneself, they're actually needed in this co-divided community or relationship. And by bringing the deepest subjective factor into play, in the psyche into play with relationships with others, the co-divided selves then create this synthesis in some manner. It's not a literal synthesis. It's a I have what you need and you have what I need. And that trade or sharing is the purpose of the descent and the purpose of the realization of God as the I. These two things working together bring about the harmonious relationship between human beings. Okay. So the lecture ends with Jung questioning, is this a great delusion? So the experience of Sindiaru Meni could be a delusion, and that's what Jung says. He ultimately says, is it possible that we're just deluding? Sindiaru Meni is sort of my interpretation of synchronicity. Synchronicity is it's become difficult to use that term because it's so loaded with post-Jungian ideas. So Sindiaru Meni would be the notion of these four things coming together between two people in a relationship that is mutually beneficial and in service of one another. So the question is this delusional? And Jung doesn't answer the question, of course, but now I want to spend some time exploring the possibility and the kind of psychological framework underlying the question, is this delusional? Okay, so let's pick back up with the question of whether the supreme creative factor, which is the hypostasis, is a delusion. So I'm going to go to two earlier texts of Jung to explicate this question. One is his dissertation, which if you read Jung's dissertation, if I could write a dissertation that was that bad and get a PhD, that would be amazing. He basically glosses over everything. His entire dissertation is him taking notes at his cousin's seance. I mean, it's really good psychologically. The interpretation is really good, but he makes very passing references to the literature in ways that would be quite nice to be able to do in the modern times. Okay. So the first one we're going to look at is his dissertation. The second one we're going to look at is an early work of his on dementia precox or schizophrenia. Okay, so his early dissertation is on the seances of his cousin, Helene Preswerk. Let me just kind of read through some of these notes. So Jung says the second personality of Helene's. So the idea is that Jung is observing Helene channeling multiple personalities in these seances. She sort of, the imagery is she goes pale white, her eyes are sunk in, her heart rate slows down, she covers her face, and then she talks as though she were someone else. She has visions and all of these things. Ivness is her alter ego in these states, and two of her grandparents come along, and there's kind of this dramatic unfolding of these multiple personalities. So Jung's interpretation is that Ivness represents her deeper self trying to come into consciousness. So she's a divided self, which has extraordinarily interesting psychological implications, metaphysical implications. But Helene is 15. She's going through puberty. Jung's interpretation here, which is still colored very much by the Freudian outlook, is that she's going through puberty, and to satisfy her sexual desires and the need to become a sexual being, this second personality from the unconscious is intruding into her conscious life. She's so constrained in consciousness because of the sort of oppressive milieu that she can't embody these attributes of a more natural woman, you might say. So they're split off, and they intrude into consciousness from the unconscious in these autonomous seances. So it's a future self that puberty is activating, in a sense. And this is the idea that autonomous consciousness exists in the unconscious. And so the question is, what is the relationship between these two? So metaphysically or psychologically, what is happening? How can one person be two people? And how can one person experience a second person as a different person? How is this possible? If I'm one person, how can I feel within myself that there's a second person? And we all know what it feels like to feel a second person. You know when someone is looking at you. You know when there's a second center of subjectivity. So how is this possible? So as two centers of subjectivity, how does one replace the other? Since a single subjectivity is assumed to be the sort of lowest unit of measurement. So it's assumed that I am one subjective person. The possibility that I am a person and I can feel myself as a second person who is looking at me seems literally crazy, right? It's literally crazy. So it must be, this is sort of the conclusion, that these subjectivities, this is my own metaphysical interpretation, these two subjectivities merge in some way. And so how can two subjectivities split? How can one subjectivity become two and then remerge as one? Maybe it's a second personality that's, here's the kind of idea. Maybe the second personality is a personification. It's being personified by the very thing that's personifying me, which is the hypostasis of the collective unconscious. And so through personification, the at least adaptation here is I will view attributes of my own humanity as being a different subjectivity. And the simplest way to say this is God is creating a exemplar in my own psychology from which I need to learn. And so the experience of a second self in the case of Helena is God is showing her who she's going to be. And he can do that with his powers of personality. And so this is sort of the idea here. Okay. So that might be one reason why it's not a delusion. So what would a delusion be? So if this works, if the personification of my future attributes works in my psychological development, isn't that the very definition of reality? It's the thing that gets me from A to B. Whatever from A to B is real. And this is not pragmatism. A pragmatism would say it's true. Well, there's two strands of pragmatism. I would say there's the Persian and then there's the other. In the most fundamental sense, it would be true that there is a sort of behavioral approach to truth claims. So truth are those things that do the work. Okay, so to that extent, I think that's right. All right, let's just move on. I don't want to get into that discussion. All right, so now let's get into schizophrenia. So on the one hand, it's not clear that this is a delusion because it tends to work for the development of the human person. And so to some extent, you would say that there are two people, and by accepting the second person as a person, if that leads to your psychological development, then how could you possibly say that it's not true? I'm not sure on what criteria, unless you bring some criteria with you already about the nature of truth. And we're trying to suspend that, and we're saying truth is the thing that does the work. And if me accepting a second personality within me as a real person does the work, right, influences me in the way that leads to my development, then it's true. Okay. So that's one reason why maybe it's not a delusion. So let's now dig a little bit more into Jung's work on schizophrenia, dementia praecox. This was one of his early writings. So schizophrenia is an extreme lowering or abaissement of the ego in such a way that there fails to exist the normal levels of apperception with respect to personified personalities. So the idea in schizophrenia is I lose my own subjectivity, the second person coming into consciousness from my unconscious, which is personified by the divine hypostasis, which doesn't have to be divine. The notion is that I'm overwhelmed by this. My typical functioning ego is not in place, and there's all these personifications of alter egos, and it's a lowering of consciousness. So interestingly, this idea of lowering of consciousness is the sort of requisite attitude for the resolution of certain neuroses. The ability to find the integrated self between these two selves is sort of the psychoanalytic cure, although in schizophrenia, it's obviously much more problematic. So the unconscious has an autonomous psychological adaptation function, which is advantageous in the adaptation to new life stages. We talked about that with Helena. The idea is these are personified future states. When it's suppressed, when the structure of new life stage is decided in advance, as it were. Okay, take a simple example. Say I'm going to school and my parents want me to do math, and I want to do something else, psychology or philosophy or something. If my life is decided in advance and I become a mathematician, you see this in one of the famous internet schizophrenics. If I repress the natural stirrings of my unconscious personality that's being personified by the hypostasis, then it's just going to get pushed down until it comes out and overwhelms my life, and I can't integrate it because it's just too autonomous. The power grows, resulting in the eventual bursting forth in the form of overpowering autonomous conscious materials. Okay. So the spirits then of the unconscious are therefore again seen as personifications of role models meant to be influences through apperception, integration, of the development of an integrated individual. So the notion to return back to Christiana's visions. So to return to Christiana's visions, she's descended into the unconscious to allow the unconscious contents to be illuminated by the darkening of the outer world. There she encounters the snake, which is at once poisonous, but also contains the possibility of the seed of her transformation. She returns into the conscious world. She sacrifices the shadow to the collective as an offering, and she is then given the revelation of God, which tells her that there is really no one perspective when understanding the relationship between people, their conscious and their unconscious, their shadow and their light. Okay, so when split off, they haunt consciousness until they eventually take control. And that is, if you don't descend into the unconscious, you may at some point in your life be overwhelmed by what you could have been. Okay, so let's sum up. In this lecture, we've seen that the shadow is the form that this content takes when it's initially presented to consciousness. So consciousness sees the shadow as this sort of demonic or evil force when it could just be the personification, according to consciousness, in such a way that it retains its quality as the rejected parts of the individual when they really should be brought into the light of day. So as such, they are personified exemplar. The shadow is a personified exemplar of the possibility of some future transformation. So long as one endures the tension of the possibility of possession, this is Christ descending into hell, endures that in the right way, then the possibility of transformation always remains. So it's the black snake that's transformed by its being brought into consciousness. It's entirely subjective and it's apparently poisonous, yet it places a demand on the ego that it must be acknowledged, for it is, according to the psychical structure, a necessary resource for some future transformation. So the idea here is a very spiritual one. The idea is that there are things in my unconscious that need to be brought into the world, and that will be the nexus of transformation between me and other people. The future, the true nature of which, as we've seen in Christianity's vision, is unknown. The nature of this resource is unknown, but it's through faith that this resource is brought into the world with humble sacrifice. And it's implicated in the eventual process of Sindhyaru Meni, which would be the co-divided nature, unity in division with the outer world. I bring my shadow and I bring my light, you bring the same. And as long as we are appropriately disposed to their interaction, there is the possibility of transformation. And this is the dualistic relationship between people that's codified in the Christian religion, that's become sort of calcified symbols, wherein we, as the Christ, allow the rejected elements of ourselves in society to come up in a appropriately sacrificial way. And this may eventually lead to the revelation of God.